For 7 long, unrelenting years, Representative Adam Schiff appeared on national television practically every single day, staring directly into the camera lens to tell the American public that he possessed absolute, irrefutable evidence that the President of the United States had committed a high crime against the nation. He claimed, with the practiced gravity of a seasoned statesman, that this catastrophic evidence was hiding in plain sight, repeating this assertion across 200 separate appearances on every major news network that would grant him airtime. He painted a masterful picture of a republic on the brink, saved only by his vigilant oversight and pursuit of the truth. Yet, when the dust finally settled on 3 exhaustive multi-million-dollar federal investigations helmed by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, Inspector General Michael Horowitz, and Special Counsel John Durham, the collective conclusion was deafeningly clear. No such evidence ever existed. The United States House of Representatives took the extraordinary step of formally censuring him, etching into the permanent historical record a severe reprimand for deliberately misleading the American people. But the political machinery simply churned forward, elevating him to the United States Senate despite the indelible stain on his credibility. The narrative seemed destined to fade into the partisan ether until Patel, the current director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the very same formidable federal apparatus that Schiff had once weaponized to demand the investigation of a sitting president, sat down at a witness table on live television, opened a physical file, and began to read aloud. He was not there to speak about Russia, nor was he there to whisper about foreign collusion. He was there to speak about a house, specifically a sprawling property in Maryland that Adam Schiff had certified on a federal affidavit as his primary residence, while simultaneously filing state tax forms claiming a luxurious condominium in California as his sole primary residence. For 17 consecutive years, across multiple binding legal documents signed under penalty of perjury, the man who had dedicated nearly a decade of his life demanding ultimate accountability from the highest office in the land had quietly falsified his own federal financial forms to save thousands of dollars in favorable mortgage interest rates. And when Director Patel finally locked eyes with the senator, stating in a voice as coldly precise as a forensic autopsy report, "You spent 7 years saying no one is above the law." "We agree." Adam Schiff, for perhaps the very first time in his meticulously orchestrated political career, was entirely paralyzed by silence, because this time the devastating evidence truly was hiding in plain sight, and the fingerprints all over it were exclusively his own. The congressional hearing room was exactly 14 minutes old, and Adam Schiff was already deep into the rhythm of his performance, navigating the grand chamber with the instinctive grace of an apex predator on familiar hunting grounds. He had spent 4 decades dominating rooms exactly like this one, first as a ruthless prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, then as a powerful congressman, eventually rising to become the formidable chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and ultimately serving as the lead impeachment manager who had once stood on the hallowed floor of the Senate and convinced 100 sitting senators that the very survival of the American Republic was at stake. He knew these paneled hearing rooms the way a virtuoso musician knows the acoustic sweet spots of a world-class stage, innately understanding exactly where to stand, precisely how long to let a dramatic pause hang in the heavy air, and exactly when to let his voice drop to a conspiratorial whisper, so that the omnidirectional microphones had to strain to reach for it, forcing millions of viewers at home to lean forward in their chairs. In those moments, he possessed the rare political alchemy to transform a cavernous room of 200 hostile partisans into an intimate room of one. His carefully scripted opening statement was a masterclass in controlled fury, lasting exactly 5 minutes as he vehemently branded the hearing a malicious continuation of relentless political persecution, boldly invoking his prior congressional censure, not as a mark of shame, but as a glorious badge of honor, and defiantly insisting that the widely discredited Russia investigation would ultimately be vindicated by the long arc of history. He forcefully hammered the phrase "rule of law" into the congressional record 4 separate times, and he deliberately weaponized the word accountability on 3 distinct occasions, before turning his piercing gaze directly upon Patel to declare that the director of the FBI was sitting across from him solely because a vengeful president had ordered him to, not because any factual evidence had dictated it. "I know the difference," Schiff declared, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. "I spent my entire career learning the difference." Up in the gallery, the shifting bodies of loyal supporters, partisan Senate staffers, and an eager delegation from the California Democratic Party responded with the low, approving murmur of a captive audience that has just watched its undisputed champion deliver a knockout blow, completely convinced that the championship belt would remain safely around his waist. Schiff sat back in his plush leather chair with the relaxed, triumphant posture of a veteran trial lawyer who had just delivered an airtight opening argument and fully expected the jury to require nothing more before delivering a swift acquittal. Director Patel, however, did not flinch, did not grimace, and absolutely did not react to the theatrical bombardment. He sat motionless behind the polished oak of the witness table, a highly unusual and deeply unsettling sight for an FBI director, who typically delegates the grueling theater of congressional hearings to a phalanx of expendable deputies. But Patel had arrived entirely alone, armed with nothing more than a single thick black three-ring binder, a secured government laptop, and the terrifying stillness of a man who had spent the better part of his career sitting silently on the other side of countless Intelligence Committee hearings, watching Adam Schiff perform. Over 7 long years of quiet observation, Patel had learned to map the exact geographic coordinates of Schiff's rhetoric, identifying precisely where the political performance ended and the unforgiving factual record began. Without a word of preamble, Patel calmly opened the heavy cover of the binder. "Senator, thank you for the opening. I want to start with evidence, Mike," he began, and the very words seemed to land with a completely different gravitational pull when Patel spoke it. When Adam Schiff used the word evidence, it functioned as a soaring rhetorical instrument, a dynamic word deployed for maximum dramatic emphasis, for shaping a partisan narrative, and for constructing the particular soaring music of a prosecution's impassioned closing argument. But when Kash Patel said the word evidence, it was stripped of all melody. It was a sterile inventory label, a clinical tag attached to a physical object inside a cardboard box that had been meticulously cataloged, sequentially numbered, and permanently placed on a cold steel shelf in an evidence room that did not care one iota about political music. "Item 1, Patel intoned. And out in the marble hallway, Schiff's seasoned chief of staff, Rebecca Weiss, felt her encrypted government phone buzz urgently in her pocket. It was a rapid-fire text message from the senator's high-priced personal defense attorney, reading simply, "What items does he have?" Rebecca, suddenly struck by a cold wave of dread, realized she did not know the answer. She quickly texted the legal counsel back with 2 devastating words that, in the highly coded language of high-stakes congressional defense, signaled a catastrophic strategic failure. "He's reading." Patel did not cue up a slickly produced video montage on the overhead screens. He did not project colorful graphics or scrolling timestamps, and he completely ignored the traditional theatrical machinery that politicians utilize to manufacture viral moments for the evening news. Instead, he simply read aloud from the tabbed pages of his binder, proceeding methodically from item to item in a flat, unyielding voice that had been surgically stripped of everything except forward momentum and chronological sequence. It was the detached voice of a field agent filling out a mandatory incident report that would be filed away in a forgotten cabinet, intended to be read only by serious people who cared exclusively about raw facts rather than how those facts made them feel. "Item 1, Patel recited into the microphone. CNN, March 22nd, 2017. Senator Schiff, then chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, states, "I can tell you that the evidence is more than circumstantial that collusion occurred." End quote. Item 2, MSNBC, February 14th, 2018. Senator Schiff states, "There is already, in my view, ample evidence in the public domain on the issue of collusion." End quote. Item 3, ABC News, April 7th, 2019. Senator Schiff states, "The evidence of collusion is in plain sight." End quote. Item 4, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's comprehensive report, filed April 18th, 2019, officially finding that the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Item 5, Inspector General Michael Horowitz's exhaustive internal report, filed December 9th, 2019, finding that the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane investigation contained at least 17 significant documented errors or deliberate omissions in critical FISA surveillance applications. Item 6, Special Counsel John Durham's final report, filed May 15, 2023, concluding that the FBI fundamentally failed to uphold their vital mission of strict fidelity to the law, and documenting that the initial investigation was improperly opened, relying almost entirely on raw, unanalyzed, and wholly uncorroborated intelligence. The cadence of the presentation was devastating in its simplicity. 6 sequential items, comprising 3 televised quotes and 3 federal reports. The quotes loudly proclaimed that damning evidence existed, while the official reports definitively proved that it did not. The vast echoing distance between those 3 quotes and those 3 reports represented the exact undeniable distance between what a powerful chairman of the Intelligence Committee had confidently told the American public and what 3 separate, highly resourced, independent federal investigations had actually found when they spent millions of dollars turning over every stone to look for it. Patel systematically closed the first section of his binder with a soft thud and smoothly opened the second tab, the rustle of the paper seemingly amplified in the suddenly quiet room. Senator Schiff had unique, unfettered access to highly classified intelligence that was strictly unavailable to the American public, Patel continued, his tone never rising. He held a position of extreme, unparalleled national trust. He read the daily, highly compartmentalized intelligence briefings that told him exactly what the real evidence actually showed, and yet he still went on national television. 212 documented recorded instances broadcast across 14 different networks over a span of 37 consecutive months, and explicitly told the American public that undeniable evidence of collusion was sitting in plain sight. 3 exhaustive federal investigations subsequently found that it was not. Therefore, the core question before us today is not whether the senator was simply wrong, because honest people are wrong every day. The question is whether the senator fundamentally knew he was wrong at the exact moment he was speaking, because he was actively reading the classified intelligence that definitively proved he was wrong, and yet he chose to go on television and deceive the public anyway. Sensing the crushing weight of the trap closing around him, Schiff immediately leaned aggressively into his microphone, relying on his deepest, most primal prosecutor's instinct, cross-examine the witness, aggressively reframe the context, and ruthlessly seize back control of the public narrative before it metastasizes. "Director Patel!" Schiff snapped, his voice sharp and dripping with practiced condescension. "Are you sitting here today acting in your official capacity as the impartial director of the FBI? Or are you operating as a bitter former staffer for Devin Nunes, nursing a deep-seated personal grudge? Because the American people who are watching this spectacle deserve to know exactly which partisan hat you're wearing today." Patel did not even bother to look up from the open pages of his binder. "I am here in my sworn capacity as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, reading directly from a verified federal file." "Item 7, Patel replied, smoothly running right over the interruption. The attempted cross-examination instantly died in the suffocating space between the hostile question and the indifferent answer. Schiff had transparently attempted to move the entire battleground of the hearing away from the damning evidence and onto the subjective territory of motive, the absolute oldest parlor trick in the defense attorney's playbook, the desperate maneuver that essentially screams to the jury, ignore the smoking gun he's showing you, and instead focus entirely on why he's choosing to show it to you. Patel effortlessly neutralized the maneuver by simply refusing to acknowledge that the parlor trick even existed. Item 7 inevitably followed Item 6 with the same unbreakable logic that Tuesday inevitably follows Monday, proceeding without a shred of argument, without the slightest need for justification, and without caring in the least whether anyone sitting in that panicked room would have strongly preferred a different day of the week. As Patel shifted seamlessly to the binder's third, deeply segregated tab, his voice did not alter its pitch, maintaining the exact same rhythmic cadence, the exact same unyielding flatness, and the exact same forensic monotone. But the actual content of his words abruptly violently shifted away from the realm of political television appearances and plunged directly into the murky depths of residential mortgage documents. This sudden pivot carried the terrifying visceral weight of a descending guillotine blade changing direction mid-swing. Item 7. Patel read aloud, the words dropping like stones into a still pond. Residential purchase agreement, dated 2003. Senator Schiff and his wife successfully purchased a luxury property in Potomac, Maryland for $870,000, securing a Fannie Mae-backed mortgage in the amount of $610,000 at a highly favorable 5.625% interest rate, specifically structured by the lender as a 30-year primary residence loan. The formal application strictly includes a personally signed, legally binding certification explicitly swearing that the Maryland property will serve as their primary and principal residence for at least 12 consecutive months. Item 8. Homeowner's property tax exemption application filed in Los Angeles County, California during that exact same calendar year. Senator Schiff formally claims a lucrative homeowner's exemption on a condominium located in Burbank, California. This specific state exemption legally requires a signed certification under penalty of perjury that the Burbank property is his absolute primary residence, and this secondary certification successfully provides him with approximately $7,000 in annual property tax reduction. Patel paused, but the silence was not deployed for theatrical effect. It was entirely clerical, the brief necessary pause of a methodical man physically turning a heavy page of evidence. Item 7 legally certifies the state of Maryland as the senator's primary residence. Item 8 legally certifies the state of California as the senator's primary residence. Both forms are official federal or state government documents. Both were signed directly under severe penalty of perjury. Both were actively in effect simultaneously. According to the strict letter of the law, a person can only have one primary residence. The senator deliberately certified two. Patel finally looked up, his gaze sweeping across the stunned gallery before settling on the silent politicians. I want to take a brief moment to tell you about a man named Frank Medina. Frank is a decorated American veteran. He served 2 brutal, bloody tours of combat duty in Iraq with the 1st Marine Division. He finally came home to Riverside, California, carrying the invisible scars of war, and in 2019, he formally applied for a VA-backed home loan to buy a modest piece of the country he had bled to defend. He meticulously filled out 14 separate complex federal forms. His claim of a primary residence was rigorously verified 3 separate times by federal auditors. Ultimately, he was subjected to a full, agonizing financial audit simply because of a microscopic typographical error in his previous address history. Exactly one single letter was wrong in the spelling of a street name. That single innocent audit delayed his critical housing closing by 45 agonizing days. He very nearly lost the house entirely, along with his family's savings. Frank Medina filled out his complex government forms with the utmost honesty, and one accidental typo nearly cost him the roof over his head. Senator Schiff intentionally certified 2 completely different primary residences on federal forms, successfully maintaining this dual reality for 17 consecutive years. By doing so, he saved thousands of dollars in highly favorable, fraudulently obtained mortgage rates. He was never audited. Instead, he was elected to the United States Senate. And the packed gallery did not dare to move, the collective intake of breath completely frozen in their lungs as the inescapable, devastating arithmetic began doing the heavy lifting. It was the simple, brutal, and entirely undeniable arithmetic of a war-torn veteran who was nearly rendered homeless over a misspelled street name, contrasted sharply against an elite, wealthy senator who successfully kept 2 luxurious homes by comfortably signing 2 contradictory forms. Patel did not bother to editorialize the glaring contrast because the sheer, nauseating hypocrisy of the contrast editorialized itself. Unbothered by the suffocating tension, Patel continued reading the meticulous refinancing history, treating each subsequent transaction as a completely separate, heavily documented item because each one represented a completely separate, legally binding affidavit. Item 9, he recited. Refinancing application, dated 2009, for the Maryland property. Signed affidavit confirming primary residence. Item 10, refinancing application, dated 2011, for the Maryland property. Signed affidavit confirming primary residence. Item 11, refinancing application dated 2012 for the Maryland property. Signed affidavit confirming primary residence. Item 12, refinancing application dated 2013 for the Maryland property. Signed affidavit confirming primary residence. That is 4 distinct mortgage refinancings executed over a span of 4 years, with each individual transaction legally requiring the senator to sign a formal document, certifying strictly under oath that Maryland was his absolute primary home. Yet during those exact same 4 years, The senator was actively casting ballots and voting in local California elections, continuously claiming lucrative California tax exemptions, and actively running for high political office representing the state of California. The senator did not officially designate the Maryland property as a secondary residence on his federal forms until the year 2020, a full 17 years after the initial purchase and 7 years after the final refinancing took place. That is 17 long years of enjoying prime primary residence mortgage rates on a property that, by his own political admissions, was absolutely not his primary residence. Schiff, finally finding his footing in the crushing avalanche of data, attempted to interject, his voice sharp, defensive, and vibrating with rising panic. Director Patel, as I have exhaustively explained publicly to the press, nearly every single member of Congress inevitably maintains necessary residences in both their home state and the capital region. This is entirely standard, accepted practice. Schiff had barely managed to force out his practiced, focus group-tested explanation, the seemingly reasonable political defense. The exact talking point his crisis communications team had rigorously prepared for precisely this line of questioning before he was abruptly stopped cold. He was not stopped because Patel rudely interrupted him. In fact, Patel did not interrupt him at all. Patel simply began speaking the very next sequential item number, delivering it at the exact volume, in the exact unhurried cadence, and at the exact precise moment that instantly reduced Schiff's desperate explanation to sounding like an irrelevant, pathetic, parenthetical note scribbled in the margins of someone else's much more important document. Item 13, Patel read, his voice slicing cleanly through the humid air of the chamber. Public statement issued by the official spokesperson for then Representative Schiff, provided to CNN in 2023 during the height of his Senate campaign. Quote, Adams' primary residence is Burbank, California, and will remain so when he ultimately wins the Senate seat. End quote, item 14. A subsequent statement issued by the exact same spokesperson during that exact same calendar year provided to a separate news outlet. Quote, Adams, California and Maryland addresses have been officially listed as primary residences for loan purposes because they are both actively occupied throughout the year, and to clearly distinguish them from a vacation property. End quote. Patel let the devastating quote hang in the air for a fraction of a second before twisting the knife. The senator's own authorized spokesperson publicly confirmed on the record that both separate properties were deliberately listed as primary residences for advantageous loan purposes. The spokesperson further described this highly illegal action as completely intentional. Therefore, according to your own team, that is not an accidental clerical error. That is a voluntary, explicit disclosure of systemic fraud. Patel methodically closed the heavy binder, carefully aligned it with the sharp edge of the witness table, and placed both of his hands perfectly flat on the polished wood. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly, unflinchingly at Adam Schiff. He did not look at his notes. He did not glance toward the blinking red lights of the network television cameras, and he did not seek validation from the gallery. He stared exclusively at the powerful man sitting exactly 6 feet away, a man who had spent 7 years ruthlessly investigating 2 different presidents, who was now suddenly discovering what it felt like to sit on the receiving end of an investigation and rapidly realizing that the temperature on the other side of the interrogation table was agonizingly different. Senator, Patel said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that commanded the absolute attention of every living soul in the room. You spent 7 years staring into cameras, telling the American public that you possessed irrefutable evidence of treasonous collusion. 3 separate independent federal investigations concluded that you did not. You held the absolute highest security intelligence clearance legally available to any sitting member of Congress. You personally read the raw intelligence briefings. You knew exactly what the facts actually said, and yet you went on television and deliberately said something completely different. You spent 7 years relentlessly demanding total accountability from the President of the United States. You self-righteously demanded radical transparency. You passionately demanded that the nation recognize that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. You were historically censured by the House of Representatives for blatantly misleading the American people. And yet, during those exact same years that you were loudly demanding accountability, during the exact same years that you were confidently telling a terrified America that evidence of crimes was hiding in plain sight, you were sitting in your office, quietly signing legally binding federal affidavits, falsely certifying a Maryland property as your primary residence, while simultaneously claiming a lucrative California tax exemption that legally required you to certify California as your primary residence. You forcefully demanded that the FBI aggressively investigate a sitting president. Well, Senator, the FBI is now rigorously reviewing your mortgage documents. You loudly proclaim that no one is above the law. We agree. Schiff's mind raced, his deeply ingrained instincts screaming at him to respond because Adam Schiff was a highly decorated former federal prosecutor, and battle-hardened former prosecutors do not ever sit in submissive silence while their reputation is immolated on live television. They aggressively cross-examine. They tactically redirect the witness. They completely dominate the psychological space of the room, or they go down swinging and die trying. When Schiff finally spoke, his voice was chillingly controlled, meticulously precise, and intensely lawyerly. It was the distinct, calculating voice of a man desperately selecting each individual word the way a trauma surgeon selects scalpels, choosing them not for their aesthetic comfort, but strictly for their lethal function. The director is deliberately and maliciously conflating two entirely separate, utterly unrelated legal matters in a desperate attempt to construct a fraudulent political narrative. Schiff hissed, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. The exhaustive Russia investigation and my personal private mortgage filings are completely unrelated subjects. This entire hearing is nothing more than cheap partisan theater, and the director is currently performing a role written for him by a disgraced former administration. Patel's response was devastatingly brief, consisting of exactly 4 words that hit the chamber with the force of a physical blow. The affidavits are signed. 4 words. There was no elaborate rebuttal, no defensive counter-argument, and absolutely no willingness to engage with the flimsy rhetorical frame that Schiff was desperately trying to build around himself. It was merely a cold, unyielding statement of physical reality. The damning documents exist in a vault. The ink signatures are permanently on them, and the signatures undeniably belong to him. Those 4 heavy words sat heavily in the dead air of the hearing room, occupying space the exact same way a massive, immovable granite rock sits in the middle of a rushing river. The violent water can thrash around it, it can desperately wash over it, and it can swirl under it, but it absolutely cannot move it. And eventually, the rushing river gets exhausted and runs dry, but the rock is still sitting there, completely unchanged. Schiff aggressively opened his mouth to launch another volley, then slowly, agonizingly, closed it. It was not the fiery theatrical silence of an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez staging a viral protest, nor was it the icy, frozen stillness of a Nancy Pelosi staring down an adversary. It was the hyper-specific, terrifying silence of a trial lawyer who has just heard the opposing counsel confidently rest their case and simultaneously realized that the evidence being presented is not an abstract argument that can be skillfully counter-argued, but a concrete physical document that can only be hopelessly countersigned or humiliatingly conceded. He could not possibly countersign it, and his political ego would never allow him to concede it. So, he was violently forced to sit entirely trapped in the agonizing space between, the claustrophobic, terrifying space that veteran lawyers know intimately and ordinary civilians can scarcely comprehend. It is the desolate space where you have not technically lost the war yet, but you realize with terrifying clarity that you cannot possibly win the battle, and the only viable strategic option left is to simply pray for the hearing to end and hope that the merciless television cameras eventually find something or someone else to watch. In a brutal 72-hour digital reckoning, Kash Patel's masterclass in forensic destruction shattered a 7-year political narrative, racking up a staggering 29 million views as the internet violently turned on Senator Adam Schiff. The massacre was immortalized in 2 devastating viral clips, one capturing Patel's icy delivery of poetic justice, reminding the world that the man who spent years hunting a president was now under FBI investigation himself, and another featuring a war-torn veteran who nearly lost his home over a typo, laying bare the sickening hypocrisy of an elite politician executing 17 years of lucrative, unchecked mortgage fraud. As visceral public outrage ignited the massive #OnePrimaryResidence movement, Schiff's panicked crisis team frantically released a defensive, heavily lawyered statement that desperately attacked Patel's character while completely failing to address the undeniable wet ink reality of the sworn affidavits. The political fallout was merciless and swift, triggering a terrifying Senate ethics inquiry and deafening, calculated silence from Schiff's once loyal Democratic allies, causing his approval ratings to plummet as the sheer poetic irony of his situation became impossible to ignore. But the true nightmare was just beginning, as the Department of Justice officially entered the fray by secretly convening a federal grand jury in Maryland, slapping the embattled senator with sweeping subpoenas demanding nearly 2 decades of meticulously documented financial records. His high-priced legal team's pathetic attempt to brush off the allegations as stale only confirmed a legally fatal pattern of systemic deception, sealing his fate in the unforgiving grammar of federal prosecution. Now, as a brand new, heavily redacted sealed docket silently appears on the Federal Judicial Registry, those 17 years of signed documents have transformed from a mere political scandal into the foundational bedrock of a sweeping, multi-count federal indictment patiently awaiting a judge's final signature. The trap has officially snapped shut, but as the ink dries on his impending ruin, the most terrifying question echoing through the whispered, panicked halls of Washington isn't whether Adam Schiff will finally face the music. It's exactly who else this meticulously documented paper trail is about to ruthlessly drag down into the abyss with him.